I will try to walk you through this. This is about my sort of latest interest to wrap up some of the ideas on design research. This is design research not as studying design as a subject or a topic, but actually working with design as a way of understanding and realizing the world around us. I have a history. Medea and I have worked together. Actually, I was supervising your master thesis years ago. Pelle was actually on the committee assessing Meta. So this is one big family. Also coming back here and being in Scandinavia, and usually we speak Scandinavian, so it is a part of home country. I don't feel as being a real foreigner. This is one of sort of some of my background. I'm originally educated as an architect. I don't know what I am today, but I have carried the title of being professor in design at the university in the Department of Engineering. I'll come back to that. My primary competence is within interaction design, and it comes from working in interaction design for 15 years. We tend to talk about it as we went from drag and drop to twist and shout, meaning we left the computer, the drag and drop, the classical interfaces, the classical displays, and tried to enter the physical realm. What we saw in the beginning of the 2001-2 thingy, or late 90s, we start to see computer science entering the physical spaces. They were popping in chips into fuses on the walls. They were making interactive environments. And somebody said interactive spaces, and we were a couple of people at the School of Architecture saying, hey, come on guys, you're entering something you don't understand. So what happens when computer science and architecture merge? That was the basic questions that we were posing ourselves 15 years ago. That brought us through a number of research endeavors, projects, centers, and building educations and so on. Apart from that, just to sort of say that I've done more than just do interaction design, I continuously find myself, I was previously a part of School of Architecture, but I've always found myself strangely sitting between design and things that happen at larger scale, sort of urban level and regional level. So some of the things that I've done previously also as a professional is designing the interiors of the suburban trains in Copenhagen. I've done working on questions like when traditional industries leave, what will take its place. This is a project carried out in Nexø. Welcome. We've done hack labs or people labs in the library, which is represented in the upper left corner, as you see there. As I said before, I was previously a part of School of Architecture. Now I'm Department of Engineering. If somebody here is in a postdoc and don't find their way of being in Malmö, please send me a note, because we're recruiting. We're trying to. I'm sorry if somebody feels like stealing co-workers or colleagues here. That's not the intention. But we're building up a unit on design research as a part of a fairly new Department of Engineering at the Aarhus University. What is that kind of thing then? If you look on the left column, we claim that we believe in drawing. We're classical designers. We communicate, we understand the world through drawing. We don't necessarily understand the world through text, as we will come back to also during today. We understand the world by producing stuff, putting it in there and seeing what's happening. So we sketch, not as sketch noting. We sketch because we anticipate things that might happen in the world. We're trying to test out. We don't know what to make yet, so that's why we're drawing, that's why we're sketching. We're finding out what to make. We believe in service blueprinting. We believe that we should anticipate what might happen in the world when we put stuff in there. As Eric Stoltenberg would say, it's intentional change in an unpredictable world. We have an intention with what we do. However, we cannot necessarily predict it, but we should anticipate what might happen there. We believe in prototyping. We believe in involving people. We believe in craftsmanship. So it does really matter the level that the prototype reaches. Just an awkward, mocked up prototype that looks awkward or foolish will not meet the requirements. We believe the craftsmanship. We believe that the final touch, and not least the last part, the keen aesthetic eye, matters a lot when we test out things. There was a suggestion in one of our you say associated neighboring or whatever fields in HEI, that was in, I believe, 15 years ago, say, could you leave that aesthetic part out of design? That would make it much easier to assess. Well, I think it's impossible for the first. For the second, it does not really make sense. Secondly, it is the nature of design to do things that are aesthetically interesting. Not necessarily pleasing, but interesting. What do we research into in a unit like the one that I'm trying to get started here? We claim we have these four, at least, to start with. We claim that we do design in the public. As experienced also in EURTAP or other research centers that has been fashioned in the Scandinavian countries over the past couple of years, or 10, 15, we have been asked to do a lot of work with or merge industries and academia. I think that's a good idea. We should be careful how we do it. And then the second thing we should also respect when being in the Scandinavian countries is that we are not USA, which has a large public sector, or large private sector and a small public sector. We walk on two legs here. So we have a large private sector, but we have a similarly large public sector. So we should split our efforts and our interests between these two. So we're interested in design in the public. Very few designers are still hired by public authorities. A lot more could do that. We're interested in exploring, producing, owning, servicing. That means who is producing. Is it just that we buy products from companies, or are we participating in the production? Do we own the stuff that we use on an everyday basis? Or is it a service that is supplied by someone? These are the things that we need to discover too, also from a design perspective. Then there is the notion of spatial agency, which I have to dwell with for a second or two. It's by purpose, it's not space architecture. People have agency, technology has agency, spaces too have. You sit in an auditorium kind of thing, I get the stage today. It changes if I start walking up here and sitting somewhere else. That agency changes. We're interested in understanding what spaces do to people, but in particular we're interested in the socio-spatial constructions that we as people do. So when I sit next to Bo here, we will have a certain space between us. We will do spaces in spaces. What does that mean? So spaces is not necessarily something that we build. Spaces is not something that we can knock. Spaces is the stuff that we do together on an everyday basis. And last but not least, we're interested in the food, energy and water nexus. We operate by producing relevant experiences in life. The last part is actually what the talk today is about. So, what is it going to talk about today? Now you've got a bit of history, so that puts me into the world and maybe make it a bit relevant to what I'm going to say today. I would provide some key general concepts on constructive design research as it's been developed from point of departure in Aarhus or in Denmark. I'll provide some concrete examples on how to do this based on an example called the co-motion bench. I'll say something about producing and analyzing in the context of design research. Sum up comments and discussions, and please do not hesitate to ask questions. If there's something in here that you say, why are you saying that? Please raise your hand and ask the question. I'm happy to do it as we go along. Why do we keep talking about design and design research? And what's so interesting? Well, is that, can you see well? I don't. I'm sorry, I get up here all the time. There's this dichotomy between research and practice. Kurt Lewin would say there's nothing as practical as a good theory. Storm P would say, in theory, practice and theory are the same, but not in practice. There is a number of discussions embedded in this. As I said in the beginning, we're trying to teach design as a way of understanding and exploring the world rather than research or design research as a topic. That means that we use the practices of design to explore the world. However, if we're professionals, we're interested in creating values for the companies that we're working with. In research, we're interested in generating knowledge that maybe later can be used and explored. That means that in research, we need to build design's intellectual value. So we're not necessarily building financial value or economical value, we're building knowledge value, intellectual value. That also makes us being cautious. Peter Gall Krogh is quoted to say that culture eats strategy for breakfast. If we just mindlessly go on using the practices or the skills and methods of practice and embed it in the endeavor of creating research, that culture will eat our strategy of gaining knowledge for breakfast. It's the first thing that goes away, because we will start working as professionals if we just mindlessly deploy the methods and techniques that we know from practice. We need to know where we're going. So to me, there is an unfruitful distinction of practice and research, because we start talking about if they were different from one another. It is the goals of them that are different. It's the purposes, it's the objectives of doing it that are different, and we should carry that in mind. So that's why we should keep talking about this, because it's tricky. In the title of the presentation, I put drifting by intention. Designers drift. We don't set out with a certain purpose, we change. And we're not alone on that. A lot of other disciplines do the same. We do so because we like success. It's no fun as a professional to start out on an endeavor asked by a company and end up saying it's a failure, it's a mistake. We like to do successes. So we adjust accordingly when we learn stuff, when we find out the production methods does not hold water, if they become too expensive, or if it's no real need for what we're doing in the target group that we're working for, we change. What we should carry in mind here is on what grounds we change and why we drift. If we do so, there's no trouble in drifting. A number of the disciplines that I now work with on a daily basis in hard sciences, they call so. They look over me or sort of look over their glasses and say, are you a hard science? And I go, depends. It's not that you can't tell why we come up with results. We're just not facts driven. And I claim that a lot of the so-called hard sciences neither are so. Are you familiar with how graphene these days? Graphene? Yeah. Okay, it's a really cool new material thing. You know how it was discovered? Okay, a bunch of scientists were sitting with a piece of duct tape and a piece of carbon, and they were going like this. Ooh, that thing. You wonder what properties this one has. So it was a hunch and a hack that spurred the whole idea of graphene. It was simply just carbon atoms sitting on a piece of duct tape that they were measuring. So and they call themselves a hard science, okay. Come on guys, could we get our grips here? So what I'm claiming here is the ways of thinking about this does not only apply to designers, but the way of acting designally is actually something that complies with a number of other disciplines. And they would actually benefit from acknowledging that this way of working also leads to results. And we would get a more proper discussion on how we get research results too. This refers to also the idea of drifting, the gravitational forces that affect drift. So where are we dragged when you sit amidst all these research concerns? Typically, we would, in an ideal way, say that we are affected by the theories that we read. We're affected by the artifacts that we produce because they inspire us to think in certain ways. And we find out that they miss certain points, so we change. We're also affected by the research interest, the questions, the hypotheses, the methodologies that we apply. And we're not least affected by how we communicate about our results. I think I'm not the only researcher that was sitting trying to write up a paper on the stuff that I went through. I was reading theories, and when writing up the stuff, I found out that what I actually delivered of results here is completely different than what I thought I was just about to write a paper about. I think most of us have experienced that. So we see ourselves, these gravitational forces drags us in different directions, and we need to be able to tell that story, not least to ourselves as senior design researchers, but to communicate it indeed also to PhD students. The work that I'm trying to present here today is built on me and a couple of colleagues, Danish colleagues, that was trying to build a course on a PhD course on research through design. And what we learned from going through the theses that others had produced, and what we thought that was valuable to put in. Can
you just explain naked?
Naked results? Yeah. Naked results, I mean the stuff that has actually come out of it. It can be numbers, for that sake. It can be video recordings from... so that's, you can say, this is what came out, the naked, before it was interpreted. Data is interpreted, whatever, it's a video recording from a ethnomethodological visit, or if it is, big data generated from sensors being embedded in something. So that's the naked results. And those naked results are interpreted in the light of research interest, artifacts, and theory and communication. Thank you for asking that question. So we did these 3 courses, and we did these 3 courses also because as design researchers we felt a bit inferior to hard sciences and more classical sciences because they have a longer tradition, and we're not really academic because we're sort of artist-based kind of strange people that do stuff. We make drawings and prototypes and models, and so occasionally we've felt inferior. I have. How might we, respecting that what we do, actually deliver good results and actually deliver things that no other discipline can deliver? How do we participate in the language games of classical disciplines? In other words, how do we make the others respect that what we do is actually valuable? So these courses that we developed, it was also about giving the PhD students a language that allowed them to do as they usually do, say what the value was of it, communicate it in a sense that would be understandable and appreciated by other disciplines. We claim what we do here is that designers and design researchers oscillate. We oscillate between analysis and synthesis. We drift because we reframe as we go along. We're not the only one that do that. A lot of other disciplines do so. I'm not saying that these are unique to designers. I'm saying it's characteristic to when doing design research, and we can find it in a number of other fields. When we ground, we also say to whom we are accountable, or to what we are accountable. In classical terms, you find them on the right. The analysis and hypothesis is a sort of hypothesizing, analyzing way of being in the world. The mid, the drifting, the reframing has to do with the ways that we experiment. And the final one has to do with how we evaluate what we do. These are some of the further reads. These are some of my co-drivers on the endeavor. Anne-Louise Bang and Thomas Markussen from Kolding. Ilpo Koskinen from Hong Kong. Polytechnical, are some of the primary key drivers in this one. During these courses, we made 3 of them. We took 10 PhD theses that's been produced over the last 10 years, approximately, in primarily Scandinavia, Northern Europe kind of thingy, into the Anglo-Saxon side. All the theses that we embedded were acclaimed to be exemplar. So they had received good reviews. They've been evaluated favorably by a number of experts, and they've been referred to quite heavily. We chose to say design research is now so mature that we can look at the stuff that we have already done. Let's see how far we've got. We did that in 3 courses, one on hypothesizing, one on experimenting, and one on evaluating. We had 60 international PhD students participating, primarily from Western European countries. We asked the students to draw their theses, to draw their questions, to use the skills that they usually do. These are the theses that we took point of departure in. And we tried to, first of all, map out what motivated these PhD students. If we take Linda Vorbin and Christina Niederer, which was 2 of them, their theses and their PhD studies was very much inclined by changes of practice. They were inclined by an artistic approach to a certain area. There were some that were motivated by ethical concerns, like Otto von Busch, Philip Ross, and Brototto. Said, how does these things hold together with the idea of design research, and how might I explore human rights through design research? How might I explore hacktivism through design research? Some were also empirical inclined. I've seen this happening in the world. How might design research relate to that? Christina Niederer was one of those, and Christian Dindler was another one, trying to explore engagement in interactive museums and installations and exhibition environments. Some were technology inclined, like Philip Ross, Christian Dindler, and some were theoretically inclined. These were sort of trying to map out what are the drivers for these people to engage into a research endeavor. What motivates them? This is what happens to design research students, design research PhD students. They come with a baggage full of fantastic skills in drawing and making and producing. And then they see, whoa, now I'm going to be a researcher. Whoa, there's a lot of theory in the world. They plunge into it, like the mole, and dig through these gigantic amounts of literature, books, surveys, papers. And at a time, they emerge from that digging on the ground and find themselves surrounded by things like programs, evaluations, and how do I do this? A lot of PhD students lose their way on that. I think a lot of us, those of you who've been through PhD studies, or maybe find yourself in the midst of them, us as supervisors have seen that happen thousands of times. No, not thousands, but tens of times. That many PhD students I haven't had. But we see it happening every time. And we continuously ask ourselves, how may we tell these PhD students that what they already are capable of, all the skills that they have, are perfectly good for getting research done? You don't have to feel, like I said, inferior to all these strong theories and fantastic academics around the world. You actually can do stuff already. Why don't you design from day one? Why do you set them aside and plunge into the theories? We would like to remedy that through the work that we did. So we asked the PhD students to draw, sit on the floor, tell us through drawings and big sketches, how do you see your own research project? Where are you right now? We did that on the, We did that by introducing a map where we said we will use, rather than some of our other colleagues that have used new concepts like programs, questions, frames, etc., we would use classical terms that is absolutely identifiable across any research discipline. So we would use hypothesis, we would use experiment, we would use questions, research questions that is, we would use evaluation, relevance, etc., etc. We would try also to ask the students to communicate, what do you mean by an experiment? Because if you're a natural scientist, experiments means that you take a phenomena that you try to reproduce in the lab. Designers go the other way around. We take a phenomena that we experienced in the lab and try to go out. So experiments mean something else, but we still do experiments. So this was a way of trying to make the students articulate what they were actually doing so it could be appreciated by others. Another thing that we've seen, which also associates with the idea of drifting, is the white sort of circle that you see happening here. We believe that experiment is the center of research through design, or constructive design research, or practice-led research, or any of the other wonderful names that we put on as emblems of what we do. We think the experiment is the cogwheel of doing what we do. However, what we also see is when we do experiments, we question our relevance. How many of you in your design research have seen that the experiment that you were doing was actually posing a different question? It was actually answering something that we hadn't seen yet. And it was directing, maybe, slowly, your research in another direction because you became motivated by something else. You were actually seeing the relevance of your research way outside the field that you were studying. So there is a feedback loop in this one. It's not just about knowledge creation, it's also what feeds that knowledge creation, which is the motivation. And it's constantly spurred by seeing the relevance outside what you're actually doing. This is what we claim is the oscillating part. We looked into these theses and tried to identify how do they then actually progress. They all deploy experiments. What is the characteristic of these experiments? So what we saw was we could find, so far we've found 5 ways of doing experimentation. The first one is a exploration of a theory nucleus. An exponent of that is Job Frenz, who did a camera that was developed on the basis of tangible user interfaces. He would do the same camera, fine-tune it, go back into lab settings, fine-tune again for 4 or 5 years in order to reach a still yet not perfect camera, but an increasingly better and better and better camera, and then thickening the theory around doing tangible user interfaces for cameras. We have the model of comparative, which is where the exponents of this are Christina Nieder and Michael Vogtman and others. It's a quite common thing. I have also to say that this is types of experiments on the level of a dissertation. So it's not day-to-day experiments. I'll get back to that later on, because these deploy also in doing day-to-day experiments. I have to watch the time, sorry. We're not there yet. But this is about doing experiments that maybe search in different directions, but have a core that you're exploring, a core concept, which in Michael Vogtman's case was kinesthetic empathy interaction. So she would do different domain explorations of that concept and go back and thicken it by that. You will have people doing serial, where you learn from one case to another. You will have people doing what we call expansive, which is somewhat similar to the geographer arriving at an unexplored island in the midst of the Pacific Sea, and you just start from one end. Say, this is a well-defined island. I'll try to understand what is on this one. So I'll just do section by section, area by area, and understand it as I go along. It doesn't matter which sort of the progression of which I do it, I'll just understand it slowly as I go along. Then there's the probing. I'll just spend a minute on this one, because this is some of the most appraised work in design research has actually happened in that area. One of the interesting things is that typically these PhD students have posed a question that's way bigger than they can actually respond to within 2, 3, 4, or 5 years. I think Linda Wobin said, technology and textiles, interactive technology and textiles. That's a fairly big area. It's not something that you can uncover in 4 or 3 or 5 years' time. It takes maybe a lifetime, or several people a lifetime to get there. Otto von Busch would do hacktivism, design and hacktivism. Takes quite a long time. So what we see, the strategy of these people is that they do interesting experiments, plot it out in an area that was way bigger than they can actually cover, and then connect them by a thread. So it's sort of, it is a probing. What is the nature of this field? It's not entirely uncovering what the field is about, but it's slowly discovering sort of hit points, small nails, spots in that area. If we look, how are these then evaluated? I have to admit that some are not evaluated at all. There's no evaluation. There's just interesting. And you go, you tell your experiences, but it's not evaluated. Otto is not here today, but it could be interesting to take his thesis. There's no evaluation at all in that one. It's no secret. You can pick out his dissertation. It's available on the web. And you can just read through it and you can just acknowledge there's no evaluation at all. So it's more eclectic. It's saying, this is interesting. This is interesting. I picked that one out. I tell some of these, it was good because a lot of people participated. Okay, that's a fairly low criteria for a thing to happen. But we characterize these repercussive, relational, serial, expansive, and eclectic. These are the ways that we've seen the PhD theses evaluate their work. I'll spend some time now on going through a concrete case which was recently done in the field of shape-changing interfaces by one of our local PhD students. I don't know if you're familiar with shape-changing interfaces. There's been a lot of doing, things that change shape rather than pixels changing on an interface. This is actually things that change in their physical form. So a smartphone that does not just sound or vibrate, will actually change form when somebody's calling you. It has some sort of side effects which is not necessarily completely uncovered. So she would actually do some studies on this, and one of the cases she would do is how can shape-changing interfaces be relevant for bringing people together in public spaces. She did this one, what she called a co-motion bench. This bench changes shape as people sit on it. It was explored in a shopping center, and it was explored in a concert hall waiting area. So as you might see here, people feel uncomfortable and they change, they start chatting. So it works on the basis of saying, well, it brings people together, because they're trying to make sense of what is happening here. And as you can see, there's a number of attitudes towards this one. Saying, this one is actually fun. Just like you would imagine a number of teenagers, oh, this one is cool. How does it work? You can hear the pitching voices also. Phew. So they started out, if we go back to the idea of drifting, they started out with the intention, how might we bring people together? By interactive artifacts. It was done also with all these people here. that one. So how is this? I'm just going to try to step down at a level. So I'm not working on a PhD thesis level, but now on a individual case level that might be embedded in a PhD dissertation. What she started out was quite classically as a designer to map out what are others doing, what do we know about this field, how might I understand the idea of shape changing, who has done work on it, what does it mean when shapes change, what might they change into, and what might we denote it as happening here. So there is a foundational shape, there's a shape it changes into, and what might be the concept that we would describe that change by. Then they would start doing a number of explorations. They started out, actually the one that's in the middle there. You see that there's sort of small cylinders sitting. The idea was to have a number of cylinders placed out in a big room, and then when people would sit on them, they would turn towards people. They were working with Linac, which is a big Danish actuator company. They don't do rotating actuators, they only do linear things. So that one was skipped because they said, we can't make it. And they go, okay, we've got to find out something else. Then different kinds of exploration was saying, is that the way? You see the one at the bottom? Another one. Then there was some technical explorations. How does the structure act when we make it change? Should it extend itself? Should it tilt itself? Should it turn? All these things were just elements in asking questions. And what you would see in that is you would see all these types of experiments. At a case you would explore a nucleus, a core idea. You would explore it in sketches. Another time you would just happily go along with whatever you found out and you would embed yourself in the flow of ideas. At other times you would just probe, because I'm completely unfamiliar with what is happening here. So you probe yourself. So a number of strategies, a number of ways would be embedded in trying to find out what this is about. We'll try once more, come on. Thank you. And it was, tested out this way. It was 5 days, 129 people tried it out. I forgot that one, that was also in an airport departure. All the subjects were debriefed afterwards. They were made semi-structured interviews to get an idea of what would they get from it. There was 2 ways of controlling it. There was one, because when you do a thing like this, where should I put the sensors? And what should the sensors look for? What sort of force should they look for? Because people would maybe just, sit on the borders of it because it is strange, or they would plunge themselves and lie onto it. They would embed a number of ways of interacting with it. So what should the sensors be looking for? That simple question has so big ramifications and implications for the design, so you can't just do that. So the first ones they would do, they was a Wizard of Oz control. So they would sit 15, 20 meters away with a control panel and make the bench work. That meant also, of course, they could react to how people would appreciate the bench. So make changes as they saw a game play out between people sitting on the bench. And the final one was actually programmed. So that was a full program, there was a full sort of standalone bench that would react just by being there, and nobody actually interacting with it apart from those sitting on it. Before I get to this one, so this was to say, when I presented you with the scheme of these ways of drifting or methods of experimentation, it's not just one way. And within the design sort of practice of everyday research, we find ourselves embedding or using any of these to the ends that we are seeking. So they will be used changeably over the period of a day. because we're exploring different aspects of what we're doing. I'm getting into the final part of the talk. I hope I'm fairly okay on time. Some of the recent work is on designerly ways of analyzing. And what we found out is basically designers don't in classical sense. We would usually see ourselves, or in a classical way, we would see a data set and then you would analyze it. Designers don't really do that. We found out what some of you might see this when you go through this. I just put it up here. What we found out is that there might be sort of the grounds on which something is experimented or thought out might be very different to the grounds on which it's tested. We found ourselves to see that we find creative or measurable ways of understanding what we've done. If you look on the left column, you will see a creative way of understanding the world. So provocative ways, subjective ways. You will find yourself doing it in very specific matters. In the middle, you will see more interpretive ways, trying to understand the way the world is, trying to make, if not formal, then at least thick descriptions of what is happening in the world. And on the far right, you will see more objective or measurable ways of understanding. Those that are completely nerds in these fields of design research will find that there are an idea about showroom, field, and lab underneath it, which refers to the work of Ilpo Koskinen and colleagues that did a book on a practice-led design research. What we tried to look into is that their book is quite ideal in the way of saying that critical design has a tendency to be on the far left, and the traditions of the Dutch has a tendency to be on the far right. If we look into the way of working, if we take Stefan Wensveen and his work on interaction of Broca, or the alarm clock years ago, again I'm talking to the nerds here, you would find that he would do classical, quite subjective work on saying this alarm clock should do this and that. Then he would design it, then he would walk into a lab to test it, if people would understand it. So there would be a big gap between how he would produce and synthesize his thoughts and the way he would analyze and evaluate the thoughts. If we go into the Scandinavian tradition of doing these things, there's a great overlap between what we're doing, the stuff that we put into the world and how we evaluate if the stuff that we put into the world is proper. It also means that we rarely get to say anything measurable, anything exact about what we're doing, and neither do we really get into the area of being subjective, provocative. We do not really produce artistic qualities, some would say so. If we go into the tradition of critical design, which is practiced by colleagues also in Sweden, and for that sake also in Denmark, but in particular has its strength in the UK, we find that the meeting place between how things are conceived in a artistic, creative manner and how it is evaluated, but also that it finds inspiration in things that we find in real life. If you go to the right, you find the data that they explore. Take Dunn and Rapey, who would do placebo objects. Placebo experiences is something that we can find in the real world. It's interpreted and embedded in an artistic way. But they find, it is in the meeting between these two that the results come up. We're at the end. I'll let you go. What I'm trying to present here is a research model on how experiments, evaluation, and forms of analysis in design research can be embraced inside the concept of drifting, or what is inside the concept of drifting. Also try to present work that allows for artistic and aesthetic judgment in the design process. So rather than, I was also referring to previously, some of the ideas in the HCI community of saying, could you leave that aesthetics out, please? Thank you. It would be way more easy to evaluate design. So how do we develop a process, or how do we develop a model for design research that respects that a native part of that is do artistic and aesthetic judgments? I've also tried to extend the grounds of design-based research that allows for different outcomes. It also, I would claim, at least from where I've presented it in other contexts, when I've presented the ideas, is that a number of people say, well, it resonates quite well with my work. The backgrounds are then engineering, biology, or nanosciences. So the interesting part here is not just that it resonates with the ways that designers work, but actually you find a number of other disciplines to say, well, that looks fairly okay with what I actually do. And last but not least, the idea here, or the intention here, is to provide designers an access point for participating in the language games of classical disciplines. So we're not just set aside as, the creative guys over in the corner that come up with stuff that makes the technological things that we do aesthetically pleasing, but actually are an equal embedded part in the design research that is, or the research that is happening. That's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I would like to invite Mette Eriksen to start giving some comments to this and some discussion. And we'll bring 2 chairs for you as well if you want to sit down.
Okay.
I think we're okay with standing up, aren't we?
Yeah.
Aren't we?
You're fine?
You have been sitting for, and I can't sit.
I couldn't go here without at least books or papers or.
Oh, wow.
Yes. I thought it was also a bit, who are we here today, or are we all engaged in design research, or are we not? So I was thinking, one way of I was mostly looking into the paper that was attached together with the invitation for preparing for today. And like I said, it's really interesting also to be here with Peter, because we used to work together for 15 years ago, and have developed in parallel but also different directions partly. I think I can see it in the paper also, and what you partly presented today, also this typology of for understanding the role of experiments in design research. I can surely see it valuable in terms of figuring out different roles that they can play, or different characteristics that they can have.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking also, how do you mostly see it? As a way of looking back and understanding? Or how would you suggest, if you are going into a project, even a small-scale master project or a PhD, how can you use this framework for planning work that you're starting to do, if you really should recognize your own design and your practice also, for example?
Yeah. I first of all, I think it's very the qualities of what we present here is not necessarily, it's not prescriptive. It's suggesting a way of understanding the way that you work. So don't change what you're doing, but acknowledge that what you do may serve different purposes. So when you do design, a lot of us as design researchers work with companies on a daily basis. We do so because we have governments and authorities that say you have to put your research into play with the companies ASAP, and we say, of course, the better, the sooner the better. Sometimes it takes longer, but that's another story. However, when we do that, we also find ourselves in situations where we have a tendency to produce professional work rather than we provide research. I don't think that there is a crime in doing so, but I think if we are not aware of what we are doing when, we are making a mistake. So the idea about this is basically to say, how might I use my professional skills as a vehicle for gaining knowledge, and when am I doing what? So it's not a prescription, but it's a map. So saying, where am I? Oh, well, I'm over here. Okay, then I don't do research anymore. Then I do professional work. Or now I'm doing research, and also to be able to tell the companies and say, "Come on, guys, you have to leave me doing my stuff too. I can't just work for you. I'm underfunded in terms of you should go and pay a consultancy in the city if you wanted that type of work done." So I think it's to that sense it's also a matter of it's a tool of navigation more than it's a go this, go this, go this, do this.
Have you used it to explain to others why you work like you do? Like to companies, for example?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I would not say I'm completely successful. I would say I find myself better off with this. With this, it's easier to explain what we do. It has helped tremendously in talking to. I grew up as a researcher with computer scientists. And it reflects my way of working and it reflects my way of thinking. But this way of thinking also helps me work with a number of other disciplines, research disciplines, and explaining why should you embed me in the research? What do I bring? And what do I not bring? The least part is very important too. Indeed, very much. And I think the strength in this is very much in the communication between disciplines. Also because I work with engineers on an everyday basis now. And they say, okay, fair enough. So you do this and I do that. Then we mix. Yeah, that's good.
I would say actually that just also we're starting a course on Monday on design-based research with second-year master students. And some of you are here, I think. Anyway, so actually that could also be a point in actually using it for understanding how can I, like what is my interest or what's my motivation, or do I want to explore an area by doing different stuff, or do I want to really dive into one?
Yep.
Or do I want to do the comparative, so I need different examples? Or, so in that sense, because it will also influence how you structure your process.
Indeed.
But we'll discuss that further next week.
Could I add to that one?
Yes.
Because I listed these ways of experimenting and left the probing at the bottom. There's not a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in terms of priority or rigor or whatever. There is just this is a list, and there's not a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They are all equal. They're all been evaluated as being proper research. I'm not here to question it, not at all. It's very important that you keep that in mind. Secondly, it allows also. The idea here is also not to. We have North American colleagues in particular. That are interested in saying we need more rigor, we need more tight methods, we need clear descriptions of what design research do and offer. And I say, no, thank you, because you're limiting the field. You're asking us to deliver stuff that we do not want to. I think the purpose here behind these papers, and I'm trying to write up a book on this, the purpose of this is to broaden the field as much as possible, to allow for as much research and as much diversity in the research as possible. And if
sketches that I was.
Yeah, thank you. I forget
those two.
Yeah, but I think it's very important. I would like to stress that one. Yes.
Also, when you mention these different methods, I'm thinking about funding applications, EU projects, and so on.
Yeah.
How do you argue that the exemplary approach and the eclectic is actually generating results that they can use?
It depends on you can use the argument saying locally, or you can use it as a more global kind of explanation through your thesis or your proposal. You can also, because you will find yourself in application areas saying, this method allows for probing a larger area. And it will not create a full coverage, but it will create ideas about what's in it. If you see a number of these EU applications these days, you will see they ask for number of consortia or whatever to uncover the full field. and you go like, yeah, come on guys, that's not going to happen in 3 years' time. So I think a lot of these application requests or proposal requests is also done on a false ground, because they're expecting us to deliver something that we cannot deliver. I don't know at the end of the day if that one will be acceptable. It's 3 or 4 years ago since design started to become a member of the research family in EU. I don't necessarily think that it's a strong hold yet. So let's see.
The other topic I would like to discuss is this phrase of drifting.
Right, yeah.
And you have exemplified a lot of examples here, and also gone further into actually how it in the talk here than in the paper, and given different examples of drifting in design, you could say, or in design research. Have you also learned something about the characteristics of that? Like, you show one example of the, but you know the designerly practice of drifting. Have you like?
Could you dive one more deeper, just to make sure that I understand correctly?
I'm thinking that the many different examples and the mapping of the many different PhDs and the ways of working shows us different ways of drifting in design practice. Overall, you could say. Not going into the details of the drifting. Have you also, on the other hand, learned by having this focus on looking at these, have you also seen in the details or learned something in the details about drifting?
I think the most prominent takeaway for us was that we were able to identify 5 sort of ways of drifting. It was when we started, it was very unclear what is actually happening here. And then we started sketching out, saying, these are typical ways. How many are there? Okay, can we understand it this way? And we used our classical tools as trying to map out and draw up how to understand this. Does it apply across them? And we quite quickly came to the 5 and said, does that cover it? Well, yeah. So far, anyway, we couldn't come up with a 6th. We couldn't, cut it down to 4. There were 5, and I think that was the most interesting part of it. Secondly, it also became clear that you could look in very broad terms of these ways of drifting on, a full thesis work, which was what we did on the 10. But also when we started looking on the everyday practices of doing design research, we could find completely similar ways of working, however, in very small detail, and also seeing it happening. One thing we should do, and we haven't done yet, is to say, okay, let's try to do video recording of designers working maybe a week or 2 or 3, and see in very close detail, how does these things change between one another? Are they recognizable, and how distinct are they in the process of working? We haven't done that yet. But it's, you can say, at the level that I showed the case of Maiken's, you can track it in her way of sketching afterwards on the single case. But it could be interesting to see how it plays out in real time, and we haven't done that. That leaves it for someone else to pick up. Please. Yeah. So.
If this is a program for design research, do you conceive design research as a standalone discipline that can manage its own research, or are design researchers collaborators in projects with other types of research?
It's probably going to be, a two-sided response to that one, because what I would claim is that we're slowly seeing the contours of a way of doing research which is not unique to those that has previously denoted themselves as designers. It's actually a way of working that connects across a number of disciplines. That's one question. I think that's partly a response to your question. And the second was?
It was either or. So if design researchers primarily works in groups with other types of researchers.
I would say that a lot of this, I've had a hard time finding out what is, clear, well-carved design research, which is not transdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary. I often find it happening there. I rarely see it. It's typically because also if you look at the relevance thing, it has a tendency to create perspectives on colliding things, on dilemmas or mismatches or something, which draws your attention in different directions in terms of research. So I think design does not, as such, hold a thing on its own, but always exist in the interplay between. Does that respond to you?
I guess if I translate it, it's about getting accepted by other researchers rather than being accepted by grant-giving authorities.
Yeah.
That you go through other researchers.
Yeah. You can say publishing about it helps us getting acknowledged by grant givers, because now there's a body of literature, and the body of literature in this field and the collective voice of it is getting so sufficiently strong and coherent that you can claim there is something in here. Yes, please.
Thank you. It was a lovely presentation and a lovely introduction to design research.
Thank you.
Which I know nothing about. So coming from a media studies background, I
All right.
would say this is very inspiring also to systematize research done in our field. So not in the hard sciences, but in the social sciences.
Yes.
So that was very helpful. But I was just wondering in terms of the 5 practices that you outlined.
Yeah.
The same that
Yeah.
is being drawn there. In one thesis, would you see several of them on a thesis level played out, or would it still be sort of in a daily level practices? They are mixed and matched.
Yeah.
Whereas in a thesis level, you still have to. It would be good if you stick with one.
Yeah. No. Yes. You don't stick to one. What we see, you can say on a thesis level, we take that one. This is a very, just due to sort of visuals. One case 1, 2, 3, common area. So that's classical way of structuring. They are. This is the domain of schools. This is trying it out in playgrounds, and this one is playing it out in hospitals or wherever, private homes, something like that. So different domains, one type of question. It's approximately in here. If you then look at each of these cases individually, they might deploy different ways of working because they involve different disciplines in getting there. Different technical disciplines, different theories. And you would also find yourself maybe in a sketching process that mixed all these things together. So I would never ever argue for one. Rather, I would say, allow yourself to do as many as possible. However, keep track of what you're doing. So rather than, there's no saying there's a a preferred way of doing it. There is hundreds of ways of doing it, but please tell them. So don't just do. Keep track. Again, also to clear ground. Yeah. Sorry.
I suppose most researchers like to get friends with people. But when you try to affect or change things in the real world, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
you have the both legs, right? You'd obviously run into people they don't care what you do, or they even get quite mad at what you do.
Yeah.
So I wonder, is it possible to think of design researchers having any sort of special knowledge of how to handle that sort of, when they get kind of difficult and the animosity rises and so on. So you have to be able to get some extra kind of knowledge in that context, if you see what I mean.
I think this is it's in the borderlands of what we are actually very intrigued by. Are you familiar with the DISIS network, Designing Social Innovation and Sustainability?
Ezio Mancini was here giving the talk.
Excellent. So Ezio was here. Ezio is not here, so it's no fun really, telling bad stories. It's more fun if he's here. Ezio don't know the difference between a project and a program, to be one thing. Program means the overall idea, and project means the actual things that we do. We had the discussion this summer, a number of us in Milano actually, on this, and saying, the big trouble about talking about social innovation for this phase is to say we do good, referring to I do design, I do good. History shows a lot of people that say I do good, but ended up doing things that was really, really bad. I think there is in terms when we talk about this, there is a design ethics, which is not at all part of that currently, but we need desperately to get in there. I have, in so few occasions, met a dissertation or a research proposal or anything saying, what are the ethical implications of doing this design research? I think that's a call for all of us to be better at doing that. We've been doing, Pelle is sitting there, doing people involving activities, co-creation. We've been making changes. We've been changing practices for 40 years through research. And since the 70s, when you were doing your stuff, starting that stuff out, there's been a dramatic decrease in the ethical concerns among design researchers. I think I think, and the other thing, rather than that one, we've been more interested in that one. So also I said, when I showed you the triangle in the beginning, I said in the ideal world, that one. In an ideal world, there was these gravitational forces. We could have put in another couple of gravitational forces, which is politics or funding. They have a tendency to affect that one greatly, without really being referenced or taking concern of. So very important that you're raising this issue. We should call for that one.
I have a question about their naked results, because I mean, are they really ever naked?
No. That's why the quotes are there. We're discussing, I'm running a course on social and aesthetic interaction this spring, and I'm asking the students to bring big data back to the citizens. We have an idea about big data, to take that, to be very literal on our naked results. Some talk about big data as a resource, as if it was a tree in the forest that we would go and harvest. It's not. It's a strong culturally bias in what data do we collect, how do we build the data sets, and what sort of constructs do we make from that. So naked is very much in quotes.
I have another question. I mean, a lot of your drifting sounds like agile product design. Let's say, Google Ventures and other people that have kind of adopted innovative methods to develop products. What is kind of the relationship between that? Because drifting is incorporated to investigate the needs of the stakeholder or further develop the profit.
Yeah.
Further develop the product for, to make it sellable.
Yeah. There is a slight defense of, I think one of the, the key notions behind this is one of the things that I've also returned to a couple of times, to saying, I'm trying to make an academic statement here that clears as large a field as possible for design research to exist in, rather than saying we need clear methods, we need well-defined tools, we need rather than going in that direction, I'm trying to make as much space as possible. So you can say there is also a contribution which is interested in a larger field.
Isn't that sort of like systematic design, you know, the German approach to engineering, where, you know, it's in the center of the cross between, you know, society and science and art and politics.
What do you, I didn't,
It's systematic design by Powell and colleagues. And it's, you know, kind of like the standard book that you get if you're studying product design in
Yeah.
Germany.
You will find design research methodology by Chakrabarty and Blessing, and you find schools of thoughts that are in line with that. I tested out the drifting paper actually at the I-Court conference, which is actually held in the community of design research methodology, to see if it could gain traction in that. And it was actually fairly well acknowledged, saying, okay, there is two ways of doing this. So rather than ruling one way out in preference over the other one, say, how might they coexist? They lead to different types of results.
But it's still, in a sense, if you go, you know, with the drifting concept, it is, you know, you're still trying to hold the curve, even though you have, you know, your back wheels are kind of, you know,
Well, yeah, you could say there was. I love that. You know, that was actually Richard's invention to put. I have to say that I really liked it, because it is actually staying on course in high speeds and not sliding off track.
or too far off track.
Yeah, or too far off track. It's a matter of temper. Yes, please.
In relation to this question, the results, will you use them to improve your design method, or to improve the design itself, or to get a knowledge to give to other fields that are your collaborators? There's also a lot of contradictory motivations in there.
Yeah. First of all, doing this will not secure that you end up delivering a good result. This is, I have to return to it, it's a map. Whether your results are sound or not depends on the empirical data or the empirical material that you built, the theories you use to enlighten your work, a number of other things. So this is not climbing down into the details of you doing your research, but it's providing that map of saying, where am I? What am I doing right now? I think the strength in this one is actually to communicate, what might I contribute? Not on a detailed level saying the social theories that I will build based on the design that I do, or the psychological proofs that might come out of the lab test that I do. This is not the level that this one is going to tell, but it's telling, when I do this, it's likely that we will deliver results in this and that direction. So it enables you to have a chat with the psychologist or the social scientist or the computer scientist or whoever you're working with and tell, this is what I might deliver in this context.
Now I'd like to take the floor again and
Good.
Ask another, maybe a bit nerdy question.
Cool.
In terms of this, understanding this design research.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Because in the paper you write, the phrase was on several of your slides, the phrase of hypothesis.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm wondering, because it's a bit unclear, at least in that paper, and maybe, I don't know, if you are suggesting this as another phrase that you suggest we rather use in relation to program. And program is a phrase, or programmatic design research is a phrase that's been used also quite a lot to speak about what it is that we do in design research, which I myself have been quite involved in developing, and which several of the co-authors that you have in these different papers and books and publications also have been writing about and applying, and Louisa and Ilpo.
Yeah.
So what's the reason for the hypothesis? Is it against the program? Is it a part of working with the programmatic approach also? Is it Yeah. Can
Yeah.
you elaborate on that?
Yeah.
Program here meaning like
Yeah.
you were saying, it's
Yeah.
for the larger frame of what
Yeah.
you're doing. It's not the single.
Yeah.
Single experiment.
Yeah. First of all, E-Box said it at a time. He said all models are wrong, but some are helpful. So I'm not saying that this one is right, but I'm saying it's helpful. If I was to say, because that discussion that is also in our could I give that one? Yes. The discussion that exists also in our work between these two is saying this one is actually philosophically, theoretically, a clear and nice one, but it's not particularly helpful. Ours is, you can say, this hypothesis is not well articulated in the paper that you refer to here, but it's messy. It's not particularly easy to it's not particularly sort of easily to track in terms of theory, but it's damn helpful. So what we're trying to be
Helpful
in terms of saying this is the map, this is where I am, this is what am I doing right now. So at the next meeting I'm going to with that computer scientist, I'll tell him that I am. That's very difficult with program, experiment, and question. Because you're sitting in between all these all the time. So this one is rather you can say, in classical terms, trying to tell what you're doing. So that's the change between the two. I think this one, if we were to theoretically argue for it, it's philosophically, theoretically, way more clear and right than this one is. This one is a way more messy thing, but it's more helpful, I'd claim.
Helpful for whom? Or where?
For the PhD student, for the researcher who's actually trying to get into that field. And for the rest of us who's trying to occasionally get our grips of what we're actually doing, because we routinize ourselves also in the everyday practices of doing research, and we forget about that stuff. And we have to occasionally remind ourselves,
How do you explain then to the people from the other fields that you're working with, that when you use the phrase of hypothesis, it connects very well or very closely tied with drifting?
Yep.
How do you explain that?
They hate it because this one, that's just, that one. Is it an either or? Does it work or does it not work? And that's where, and this one, where this one is, you can say, a bit wobbly in that paper at its best, because basically that paper is about that one. It's more about motivation than it's about hypothesis. It's more about saying, why do I ask this question? It's more saying about where am I going, rather than it's saying about this or that. So it's very much about building questions and based on your motivation, rather than it's strictly that one. Admitted. Anyone else who want to take a stab on that one? Yeah. And it is. Indeed it is.
I can just sketch the other illustration that's in some of those other books program here.
Yeah.
Then there's something called a question around, which I definitely have argued myself is not a good word in this context.
No.
It becomes a bit technical, nerdy maybe now in terms of understanding different. Then there's different experiments here to explore the program. The program, there's also a lot of. So I want to give you this book actually that's been developing it further than the references you.
I have 2 examples of it back home. No.
But the way it's described in the paper, it's back to an old paper where it's simplified more.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, I don't think, go into the discussions of hypothesis that actually happens here. It doesn't go into the elaborations about this not being one question, but a domain, you could say.
Yeah.
Or, and positioning in that domain. For example.
The thing that is missing is how you get from there to that.
And how you connect them.
Yeah.
That's true.
And that's
also why I fully agree that where this ended, it doesn't go particularly far into experiments.
No.
But you say in your paper also that hardly no one else has done anything about experiments or elaborating these experiments, and at least there was a conference also
Oh yeah, that
here
one.
and there about experiments in design research.
But that's,
So-
yeah.
So it's not true that no one else has written about experiments, just to get the references right. But anyway,
And?
and I guess I needed to say that.
Yeah.
Further, I think you didn't answer. Do you want to propose this rather than this because you think it's easier to understand?
I would. Yes,
because I spoke to Anne-Louise, who's one of the co-authors, and she said it as a part of our way of getting into a programmatic approach, for example. So that they can work together also.
I don't necessarily see them as either or.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to say here is that also by using that quote of E-Boxed in the beginning, all models are wrong, but some are helpful. These are not going to change dramatically what is happening. These are tools for communicating what is happening. Mm-hmm. It can be a tool for the researcher, him or herself, in articulating what am I doing, but it might also be a tool in the process of that researcher communicating to external parties, what am I doing? And I think it's very important that we get tools for telling that story. Not for getting tools that keeps us on track, because tools that keeps us on track are delimiting. And we don't need that. We need multiple parts and multiple answers or responses to common questions, and not, single-minded ones. So clearing as much field as possible must be, at least in my terms, the goal of these maps.
And you believe by using the same phrases in design research that's being used in other fields, even though we apply them quite differently.
There is. I think there's one thing that also always gets stuck in this system, and that is the word experiment.
Yes.
It always gets stuck in this because we have a tendency to say, well, experiments in natural sciences, and they are the ones that do. No, one do experiments, and we do it in numerous ways. You can go to anthropologists, you can go to designers, you can go to engineers, you can go to anywhere. We all do this. But every time we talk about it, it's about reproducing phenomena in the lab as a biologist or a chemistry or a chemist or whatever would do. And they are not the ones that have patent on the word of experiment. We can all have something to say on that, but we just have to tell what we do when we do experiments. So I'm saying, use the same word, tell what's in it.
So, Peter has plenty to press, so I think I have about 5 more minutes, so we don't want to rush it, but do you have anything you want to conclude before? Do you have any concluding questions? Anyone else? Yes.
Good.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the difference between a design researcher and a design practitioner, just because often research projects sometimes involve both a client and a university. So I'm just wondering, apart from goals, is there other differences in how you should be behaving or doing more?
I understand it, and I appreciate that that's a dilemma, and everyone is in it. However, I won't be able to give you any explicit answers to that one. The only thing I can say, which is actually returning also to that slide in the very beginning, that one, about where I was trying to say that there is an unfruitful dichotomy between practice and research. There is a necessary dichotomy or necessary distinction between building knowledge and producing, financial or economical value. We should maybe talk about it that way when we talk about collaborating with companies. When are we building one or the other? So it's a concern of the value that you create. Also saying research is interested in intellectual value. We're not necessarily interested in building financial value. We occasionally do because our prototypes may gain also commercial traction, but it might not be the goal or have been the goal when we produced it. I also seen a lot of things that was actually intended to build intellectual value but ended up doing something else. So I don't necessarily try to say it's an either or, but it's you staying on track of what you're doing when you engage in the activity. There was one over here also.
There was two questions, but I'm not sure we have time, so you can pick up one.
Yes.
One is like, so what you're trying to say is a way to communicate our way to work within intuitive reasoning that is so inherent for designers, but we cannot explain. So this is one question. Like, how does this differ from a very commercial model of what you do, the American way, like the Tim Brown's design thinking way of commercially?
Yeah.
And the other is like, you mentioned a lot about building theory and knowledge, but then you show an example where there is a materialization of an object of design, the bench itself. So how do you integrate this other area of us as designers to build prototypes within this intuitive thinking and exploration?
What was the first part of the question? I got this last three, or the last two.
The first part is like, you have talked about creating knowledge, and then you show a project where you actually materialize a bench.
But that was, no, that was the intuitive one. You were talking about intuitive,
I asked if you were giving us a mean to communicate intuitive reasoning as a process, since it's so hard because it's intuitive and not rational.
Yeah.
And design thinking, commercial model of doing a Tim Brown commercial model of like design thinking, if it's the same in a way, like a way to communicate, but of course it's much more on his brand or something like this.
So there's three questions in this one. There's about the intuitive, then there is design thinking, and then there is the object as you can say, a knowledge production in itself. Intuitive, if you stop by only being intuitive, there's no knowledge building in it. If you are incapable of stopping, it might produce a valuable result for a company in the city. All right, go there, do that. Don't call it research. If you're unable to tell what the knowledge gained from these processes are, make it collide with theory, tell how it advances current thinking and theory, it's not research. It's a very simple one. Design thinking, I'm very reluctant in using that term because I don't really think that there's such a thing as design thinking. I think there's a lot of design doing. Design is done, it's not thought. Design might be a way of conceiving and working with, but it's not just a way of thinking. Design thinking has a tendency to sound as if we could sort of, smother it out, apply it to something, and then it becomes design because it was done in design thinking. Do you know where it came from? Yeah, it came from IDEO not making money because they were continuously finding themselves going out to clients and they would do a lot of work to get to a product. And what they would get funding on in their old business case was to get that product into production and put onto markets. And a lot of these companies would say, very interesting thing you got there, but we don't think time is mature to put that thing on market. So they were getting no money for all the research they put into getting to that product. However, that knowledge was delivered to the company. So they were losing money. They're putting a lot of efforts into it. So then they stop, we're going to make money on that, building knowledge. And that capacity of doing that in certain ways. We'll call that design thinking and we'll make money from it. And we'll make a school in Stanford that lives from this. That's the story, the history. So I don't think that's an academic term. I think it's a wonderful business term. And I think it works very well in consultancy, and you can make a lot of money based on hourly saying, I do design thinking. I don't think it's a strong academic term. Object. Like musicians do a piece of music and write it up by using score sheets, so do designers. We use images, we use drawings, which all embed knowledge. So of course, objects can be seen as knowledge production. However, it can be really hard for non-designers to understand the knowledge that's embedded in there. In order to communicate with those people, we use text, because that's a unifying language. We also find ourselves as designers being occasionally trapped in that, because there is knowledge in there which cannot be really communicated in words. We've seen that a number of times where we've done conferences and said, well, we need to embed videos, we need to do objects because there's a lot of knowledge in it. And true, but it's just damn difficult because papers are just so nice to handle online. And you know, physical objects don't travel that well. And particularly when they get the size of rooms and buildings. It's got to go, we've got to go there ourselves. So they're often left out, and they also, it diminishes our capacity in academic circles to read those kinds of objects. Because we continuously becomes acquainted with that knowledge is something that's read through text and not through objects, drawings and images.
Okay, we could have gone on.
We go far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, now if there's more questions, you have to follow him on the train to custom. Thank you for coming. Thank you.